In the heart of Memphis, where cracked sidewalks hold generations of stories, lives Jack Grayson, a Vietnam veteran and retired mechanic with a quiet, unshakable strength. His life has been steady, built on routine, family, and the pride of making an honest living. But even in familiar places, storms can brew. One ordinary Friday night, Jack's world takes an unexpected turn when the glow of red and blue lights fills his rearview mirror. What should have been a routine drive home becomes a night that will test everything Jack thought he knew about fairness, dignity, and resilience. Detained without cause, questioned like a suspect instead of a citizen, Jack finds himself caught in a battle that's bigger than he is, a battle not just for his freedom, but for his very sense of justice. But Jack isn't alone. His grandson Nate, sharp and resourceful, steps in with quiet determination and connections that run deep. Together, they navigate a system that often silences the powerless. Along the way, Jack's struggle resonates with his community, sparking a wave of unity that no one saw coming. How does an aging veteran take on a broken system and emerge stronger? What happens when ordinary people refuse to stay quiet? Jack Grayson was a man whose life had been defined by hard work, tough choices, and sacrifice. At 66, he carried himself with quiet strength. His hair was silver but thick, and his eyes, once bright and hopeful, had taken on a steely calm. A Vietnam veteran and retired mechanic, Jack had seen more than his fair share of the world's harshness. Yet he never let life's bitterness define him. He woke up each day with purpose, even if that purpose was small, fixing an old appliance for a neighbor or picking up groceries for dinner. Jack lived in a small, weathered house on the edge of Memphis. The neighborhood had seen better days. The streetlights flickered at night, and the sound of distant sirens was a nightly chorus. Most of the homes were run down, their paint chipped, and their porches sagging. But Jack kept his place tidy. The shutters might have been old, but they were painted. The lawn might have been modest, but it was cut. It was a house built on pride. His pride and joy, though, was his black 1976 Chevrolet Caprice. The old car was a relic of another time, its chrome edges dulled by years, but still holding an undeniable charm. On cold mornings, the engine sputtered like a cough from an aging smoker. But Jack loved that car. It was the one constant in his life that he had built and rebuilt with his own hands. But what Jack loved most in this world was his family, especially his grandson Nate. Nate was smart and capable, though his life was a bit of a mystery. Nate's job kept him on the move, always talking about assignments, but offering no details. Jack didn't pry, he respected Nate's privacy. He just wanted his grandson to be safe. That night, Jack had made a quick trip to the grocery store. The trunk of his Caprice held a simple load milk, bread, and a can of chili. The streets were empty except for the occasional rusted-out pickup truck or a stray cat darting between shadows. The humidity hung thick in the air, sticking to Jack's skin like damp cloth. The radio crackled, playing a slow blues tune that matched the quiet hum of the engine. Just as Jack turned down Monroe Avenue, his rearview mirror lit up with a burst of red and blue. "Well, here we go," Jack muttered under his breath. He signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. The old Caprice rumbled to a stop as Jack switched off the radio and waited. He could feel his pulse quicken, a familiar unease settling into his chest. Two officers stepped out of the squad car. They looked young, too young to understand the weight of authority. The first officer, chewing gum with exaggerated movements, approached Jack's window and shone a flashlight directly in his face. "Good evening, sir. Mind telling us what you're doing out this late?" Jack squinted against the light but kept his voice calm. "Just driving home from the store. I'm guessing that's still legal." The officer smirked but didn't back down. "License and registration." Jack handed them over without a word. The second officer circled the car slowly, peering into the back seat as if he expected to find stacks of stolen goods or something more sinister. "What's in the trunk?" the second officer asked. Jack let out a short, dry chuckle. A spare tire, a jack, and a toolkit. You want to see for yourself? The officers exchanged a glance, the kind that said this would not be a quick stop. Step out of the car, the first officer ordered. Jack hesitated, then exhaled and reached for the door handle. He stepped out slowly, keeping his hands visible. His heart pounded, but he kept his expression neutral. Let's keep this simple, Jack said, his voice steady. I've been through enough not to make trouble. The officers patted him down, their hands quick and impersonal. They found nothing but Jack's old fishing knife and a crumpled receipt. Jack watched their faces, searching for any sign of fairness or reason. He found none. Where were you at 9 tonight? The first officer asked. Jack raised an eyebrow. Buying groceries. You need the list? The second officer crossed his arms, his expression hardening. There was a robbery at the gas station on 5th Street. Your car matches the description of the getaway vehicle. Jack stared at them, incredulous. You think this old Caprice is a getaway car? This thing can barely get away from a stoplight. The officers didn't laugh. Instead, the first officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs. You're being detained for questioning, he said, his tone almost smug. Jack felt his pulse rise, but he kept himself calm. On what grounds? We'll figure that out at the station, the second officer replied. The cold metal of the cuffs bit into Jack's wrists as they locked into place. The officers led him to the back of the squad car and pushed him inside. Jack kept his eyes forward, determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing his frustration. The ride to the station was long and silent, broken only by the faint hum of the police radio. Jack stared out the window, the familiar streets of Memphis blurring past in streaks of light and shadow. He thought of Nate, of the countless lessons he had tried to pass on to his grandson, about patience, resilience, and dignity. Now those lessons felt like a challenge from life itself. At the station, Jack was led into a small, cold room with metal walls and a single chair bolted to the floor. The officers left him alone, but Jack knew this was far from over. He sat down, rested his hands on the table, and let out a slow breath. This was not the first time Jack Grayson had been tested by life, and if there was one thing he knew, it was this. Storms passed, and no matter how hard the wind blew, he would not break. As the hours dragged on, Jack whispered to himself, "This isn't the end." In that quiet room, where hope could have flickered out like a match in the wind, Jack's resilience burned like a steady flame. The small interrogation room smelled faintly of bleach and stale coffee. Jack sat quietly, hands resting on the cold steel table. The room was bare except for a one-way mirror that reflected his own tired face back at him. He had been in rooms like this before years ago during his service. He had learned to keep his breathing slow, his mind sharp. But that had been war. This was supposed to be home. The door opened, and the two officers walked in. Gumchewer took a seat across from Jack, while the second one, who Jack had mentally nicknamed Swagger Boy for his overconfident stance, leaned against the wall with his arms crossed. "Well, Mr. Grayson," Gumchewer began, flipping open a thin manila folder, as if it contained some kind of revelation. "Mind telling us what you were doing near 5th Street tonight?" Jack raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "I was driving home from the store, like I told you." "Near 5th Street?" Swagger Boy cut in. His tone was sharp, almost taunting. Jack shook his head. "No, I took Monroe all the way. 5th's nowhere near my route." The officers exchanged a look that told Jack they weren't interested in the truth they were fishing, hoping he'd trip up. Gumchewer leaned forward, his fingers tapping on the table. "Do you know there was a robbery at the gas station on 5th? Jack tilted his head. "I don't keep up with local crime reports. I was at the Piggly Wiggly, picking up groceries." He nodded toward the door. "The receipt's in my jacket pocket, if you want to check." Swagger Boy snorted. "Convenient." Jack folded his hands. "No, just the truth." The air in the room thickened as the officers stared him down, waiting for him to break. Jack didn't flinch. Gumchewer slammed the folder shut, as if to punctuate his frustration. "You fit the description of the suspect." Jack let out a dry chuckle. "Let me guess, tall, black, driving an old car." Swagger Boy's jaw tightened. Gumchewer forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We're just doing our jobs, Mr. Grayson." "Sure," Jack muttered. "And I'm just trying to live my life." Minutes passed like hours. The questions continued, each more ridiculous than the last. "Where were you before the store?" "Did anyone see you?" "Why were you out so late?" Jack answered everything with calm precision. "Home. No, I felt like having chili." Eventually, Gumchewer sat back with a dramatic sigh. "You know, you could make this easier on yourself if you'd just cooperate." Jack leaned forward slightly, meeting his gaze. "Cooperate? With what?" "You're trying to pin a robbery on me because my car is old and black just like me. You're not looking for answers. You're looking for someone to blame." The room went silent. Swagger Boy shifted uncomfortably, but Gumchewer's face darkened with stubborn pride. "Let's see how cooperative you are after a night in a cell," Swagger Boy muttered. He walked over and unlocked Jack's cuffs, then gestured toward the door. Jack stood slowly, rolling his shoulders to ease the stiffness. "I've been through worse, boys," he said as they led him out of the room. The holding cell was as cold and bare as the interrogation room. The walls were concrete, and a single metal bench ran along one side. Jack sat down with a sigh, resting his hands on his knees. His thoughts churned in his head, but outwardly he was still. How had it come to this? He had served his country. He had built an honest life with his own two hands. Yet here he was treated like a criminal, for nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He thought about his grandson, Nate. He pictured the boy's steady eyes, the way he always seemed to carry a quiet strength of his own. Jack had tried to teach Nate the value of staying calm under pressure, of keeping your head when the world wanted you to lose it. But as he sat alone in that cell, Jack couldn't help but wonder if staying calm was enough. The hours dragged by. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a harsh glow that made it impossible to rest. Jack leaned back against the wall, letting his mind wander to simpler times. Fishing trips with Nate when he was little, the smell of engine grease in his old shop, the first time he ever fixed the Caprice's sputtering engine and heard it roar to life again. The sound of a door opening snapped him back to the present. Jack glanced up as an officer appeared at the bars, but it wasn't one of the two who had arrested him. This one was older, with gray at his temples and a thoughtful expression. "Grayson," the officer said, unlocking the cell door, "you've got a visitor." Jack stood, frowning in confusion. He wasn't expecting anyone. As he stepped out of the cell, he heard the low hum of familiar footsteps. Nate. Jack's heart lifted as his grandson appeared at the end of the hall, wearing a sharp navy suit that looked freshly pressed. Nate moved with quiet purpose, his eyes locked on Jack as if the rest of the world had faded away. "Nate?" Jack's voice was steady, but there was a flicker of relief beneath it. Nate reached him in a few strides and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Come on, Grandpa, you're getting out of here." Jack's eyes narrowed. "What's going on?" Nate smiled faintly. "Just trust me." The officer behind them cleared his throat awkwardly. "He's clear to go, all charges dropped." Jack's breath left him in a rush. "How?" Nate handed a thick folder to the officer at the desk. "Video footage, timestamps, and about 5 witness statements from the grocery store." His tone was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "They arrested the wrong man." Jack exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time that night. As they stepped outside into the early morning air, Jack turned to Nate. "You didn't have to get involved." Nate's jaw tightened. "Yes, I did." They stood in silence for a moment as the dawn began to paint the sky with soft streaks of orange and gold. Jack reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled pack of gum, and offered a piece to Nate. Nate chuckled and shook his head. Jack unwrapped a piece and popped it into his mouth, the taste of mint sharp against the bitterness of the night. "Thanks, Nate," Jack said quietly. Nate's eyes softened. "You taught me to stand up for what's right." Jack nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good, because this isn't over." Nate's gaze sharpened. "I know, but for now, let's get you home." Jack's caprice waited for them, gleaming faintly under the morning sun like a sentinel. Jack climbed in, letting the hum of the engine settle into his bones. As they pulled away from the station, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet, steady hope. Jack's caprice hummed gently as it rolled down the street, the old engine steady despite its age. The sun was climbing higher now, casting long golden streaks over the cracked pavement. Jack sat quietly, staring at the road ahead, but his mind was still back in that holding cell. He had spent the night behind bars for no reason other than suspicion wrapped in bias. His fists clenched slightly on the steering wheel. Nate glanced over from the passenger seat, his usually calm demeanor still intact. Jack could feel the tension radiating from his grandson, though. Nate had always been good at keeping his emotions in check, but Jack knew this whole situation had hit him harder than he was letting on. "You want to talk about it?" Nate asked finally, breaking the silence. Jack let out a slow breath. "What's there to say? This isn't the first time something like this has happened. Might not be the last." He paused, keeping his eyes on the road. "But you being there, that meant something." Nate nodded, his gaze shifting out the window. "I figured you'd rather walk out of there with proof than anger." Jack gave a small, appreciative nod. "You were right." The Caprice took a slow turn as they pulled into Jack's driveway. The small house, with its white siding and green shutters, looked the same as always, modest, but well kept. The flower bed his late wife had planted years ago still held bright bursts of color, even if the paint on the porch steps was starting to peel. Jack turned off the engine and stepped out, the morning air warm against his skin. Nate followed, his long strides steady. They made their way up the porch steps, but just as Jack reached for the door handle, he hesitated. He felt the weight of the night's events pressing down again. Nate noticed. "Grandpa?" Jack gave a quiet shake of his head. "Come inside. I'll make some coffee." They entered the small kitchen, the smell of wood and old leather filling the space. Jack's kitchen was as practical as the man himself. No frills, no unnecessary clutter, just clean counters, a few old appliances, and a ceramic mug Nate had made in school years ago that still sat proudly on the windowsill. Jack reached for the coffee pot and set it to brew. The familiar hiss and drip of the machine filled the quiet. Nate sat at the small kitchen table, resting his arms on the surface. "We should file a formal complaint." Jack shook his head as he grabbed 2 mugs. "What good would that do? They'd bury it under a pile of paperwork or slap those officers on the wrist." He poured the coffee, then handed a mug to Nate. "You can't fight the whole system, Nate." Nate took a sip, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe not. But you don't have to fight it alone." Jack sat down, the chair creaking under his weight. He stared into his coffee, the steam rising in soft tendrils. "You really believe that?" Jack asked. Nate met his grandfather's gaze, his eyes steady. "I do." Jack sat back, letting Nate's words settle in. It had been a long time since anyone had made him feel like he had allies. He had spent so much of his life fighting alone against the system, against circumstances, against time itself. The quiet moment between them was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up outside. Jack frowned and set his mug down. "You expecting someone?" Nate stood and peered through the window. His expression shifted to something calmer. "No, but I think you're about to get some unexpected kindness." Jack raised an eyebrow and walked over to the door. When he opened it, he was greeted by the sight of his neighbor, Mrs. Perkins, standing on the porch. She was a small woman in her 70s, always wearing some shade of lavender. Today was no different. Her dress fluttered slightly in the breeze, and she held a brown paper bag in her hands. "Morning, Jack," she said, her voice warm but concerned. "I heard about what happened last night." Jack sighed and leaned against the doorframe. "News travels fast." Mrs. Perkins nodded. "This neighborhood looks out for its own." She held out the bag. "Thought you might want some homemade biscuits and jam. I know how you hate cooking when you're upset." Jack blinked, caught off guard by her gesture. He reached out and took the bag. "Thanks, Mary." She smiled softly. "You're a good man, Jack, no matter what anyone says. And people around here know it." Jack felt a lump form in his throat as he watched her walk back down the porch steps and wave before heading home. He closed the door and carried the bag to the kitchen table, setting it down carefully. Nate was watching him, a knowing look on his face. "Like I said, you're not alone." Jack gave a small smile. "Maybe not." They sat for a moment, eating the warm biscuits and savoring the sweet jam. Jack hadn't realized how hungry he was until he took the first bite. As they finished, Nate leaned back in his chair. "What's the plan now?" Jack's smile faded slightly as he thought about the officers who had detained him, the arrogance in their eyes, the way they had treated him like a criminal without cause. "The plan," Jack said slowly, "is to make sure they learn you can't treat people like that and get away with it." Nate's eyes lit up with quiet approval. "You've got some ideas, then?" Jack nodded. "But I'm going to need your help." Nate grinned, a rare, full smile that reminded Jack of the boy Nate used to be. "You've got it." The sun was rising higher, casting a soft glow across the neighborhood. Jack's home, with its peeling paint and worn porch, had never felt so steady beneath his feet. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt something unfamiliar, a spark of hope that things could change, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly. He looked at Nate, who was gathering his coat and keys. "We start by making some noise." Nate nodded. "Let's show them what resilience looks like." Jack's grin widened as he grabbed his keys and followed Nate to the door. The old Caprice waited outside, the sun glinting off its worn but proud frame. As they climbed in, Jack could feel the weight of the night lift just a little. With the hum of the engine beneath him and Nate by his side, Jack shifted into gear and pulled out of the driveway. The road ahead was long, but Jack had never been afraid of a challenge. This time, though, he wasn't driving alone. The drive to downtown Memphis was quiet, but there was an unspoken understanding between Jack and Nate. The morning sun warmed the worn leather seats of the Caprice, and the steady rumble of the engine was oddly comforting. Jack felt steadier now, though the memory of the night before still churned in his mind. He wasn't sure where the road they were on would lead, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let those officers walk away without accountability. Nate leaned back, his gaze fixed on the passing buildings. "So," he began, breaking the silence, "what's the first move?" Jack tightened his grip on the wheel. "We need to make it official. That means reporting what happened. But I'm not naive. I know they'll try to sweep this under the rug unless we have real leverage." Nate nodded thoughtfully. "Good thing I brought some." Jack glanced at him. "You mean the security footage and the witness statements?" Nate's smile was slight but confident. "That, and a few names in the right places. I made some calls after I got your message last night." Jack raised an eyebrow. Nate's calm demeanor had always reminded him of a coiled spring, still on the surface but ready to act when needed. "What kind of calls?" Nate gave a small shrug. "Let's just say there are people who owe me favors. People who pay attention when something like this happens." Jack felt a flicker of pride mixed with curiosity. "What exactly do you do, Nate?" Nate's smirk was almost mischievous. "Let's just say I handle problems. Quietly." Jack let out a low chuckle. You could have warned me before I got thrown into a holding cell. Nate laughed too, a sound Jack hadn't heard from him in a long time. Where's the fun in that? The Caprice rumbled to a stop outside the Memphis precinct downtown. The building loomed large, its stone facade worn by decades of weather and protests. Jack turned off the engine and stared at the station's double doors for a moment. You ready for this? Nate asked. Jack nodded slowly. Yeah, I've had enough of keeping quiet. The two men stepped out of the car, the morning heat already thick in the air. As they walked toward the doors, Jack straightened his shoulders. Inside, the front desk officer looked up as they entered. His bored expression flickered with surprise when he saw Nate. Jack watched the officer sit up straighter as Nate approached the desk with a folder in hand. Good morning, Nate said smoothly, setting the folder down. We're here to file a formal complaint against Officers Gaines and Mercer. The officer blinked, unsure how to respond. A complaint? Nate nodded. That's right. Inside this folder you'll find security footage showing my grandfather, Jack Grayson, entering a grocery store at the exact time the officers claim he was fleeing a crime scene. The officer hesitated, reaching for the folder. I'll have to get the captain. Please do, Nate replied calmly. Jack crossed his arms, silently watching the exchange. He wasn't used to seeing someone take control of a situation with such ease. Nate had always been sharp, but Jack was starting to see the steel behind his grandson's quiet nature. Within minutes, a tall man in a pressed uniform emerged from the back. Captain Rollins. Jack recognized the name. He had a reputation for being by the book, but fair. Rollins glanced between Jack and Nate before picking up the folder. His eyes skimmed the contents, his expression tightening as he read through the witness statements and watched the screenshots from the security footage. You've made your point, Rollins said finally, closing the folder. The officer's report doesn't match the evidence you've provided. He set the folder down and met Jack's eyes. Mr. Grayson, I'm sorry for what happened to you. This should never have happened. Jack's jaw tightened. He wasn't in the mood for empty apologies. Sorry doesn't change the fact that I spent the night behind bars for no reason. Rollins nodded solemnly. You're right, and I'll make sure those officers are held accountable. Internal Affairs will be contacted, and I'll personally see to it that a full review is conducted. Jack felt the weight of Rollins' words, but he had heard promises before. He glanced at Nate, who gave him a small nod. Jack took a slow breath. All right, we'll hold you to that. Rollins extended his hand. Jack hesitated for a second, then shook it. The handshake was firm, but Jack felt the unspoken tension behind it. Rollins knew this situation was bigger than just one complaint. It was a reminder of the cracks in the system. We'll be watching, Nate said quietly as they turned to leave. Rollins gave a curt nod, and Jack and Nate stepped back out into the blinding sunlight. They walked in silence for a few moments before Jack spoke. Think they'll follow through? Nate's eyes were thoughtful. They will if we make sure they don't forget. Jack stopped by the Caprice and leaned against the hood, the warmth of the sun sinking into his skin. You've grown into a hell of a man, Nate. Your parents would be proud. Nate smiled, but there was a flicker of something else in his expression. Loss, maybe, or longing. Thanks, Grandpa. That means a lot. Jack nodded, reaching into the paper bag from earlier and pulling out the last biscuit. He handed it to Nate with a grin. Fuel up. We're not done yet. Nate took the biscuit with a laugh, and for a moment, they let themselves enjoy the quiet morning. As they climbed back into the car, Jack felt a shift within himself. The helpless anger that had filled him last night was slowly giving way to something stronger: determination. He started the engine, the familiar hum steady beneath them. So what's next? Jack asked. Nate glanced out the window as the city rolled past. We keep pushing. If they think they can close this quietly, we'll remind them we're still here. Jack nodded, his resolve strengthening. "You've got my back. I've got yours." Nate's gaze softened as he turned to Jack. "Always." The Caprice rumbled down the street, its worn frame carrying the weight of their shared purpose. Jack didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but he knew one thing: change wasn't a sprint. It was a long, steady drive, and he wasn't about to let up on the gas. A week passed, and the tension in Jack's life felt like a rope pulled too tight. He tried to go about his usual routines, tinkering with the Caprice, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee. But the quiet was different now. His neighbors knew what had happened. Some would stop by to check in. Others simply nodded with solemn respect. The whispers spread, though. A story like Jack's couldn't stay contained in a neighborhood like his. Before long, word of his wrongful detention made its way to local news reporters. A short column appeared in the morning paper. "Local veteran detained in error." Jack had folded the article and set it on the table, but every time he saw it, a familiar anger stirred. Nate had been working behind the scenes. Jack didn't know exactly who his grandson was calling, but he trusted him. And when the letter came summoning Jack to appear in court for a formal review hearing, he felt both dread and relief. The morning of the hearing was bright and too cheerful for Jack's mood. He dressed in his Sunday best, a clean white shirt, pressed slacks, and the old leather boots he'd had for decades. Nate met him outside, looking sharp in his navy suit. "You ready?" Nate asked, adjusting his tie. Jack gave a short nod. "Let's get this over with." The drive downtown was quiet. Jack's mind spun with questions. What would the judge say? Would this be a real fight for justice, or just another charade? The courthouse was as cold and impersonal as Jack remembered from years ago. Rows of wooden benches, polished floors, and a judge's bench that loomed high above everything else. Jack took a deep breath as he and Nate entered, the echo of their footsteps filling the room. The courtroom was sparsely filled, just a few reporters, some locals who had come out of curiosity, and Mary Perkins sitting in the back row, with her hands folded like a churchgoer waiting for the sermon to start. Jack felt a flicker of warmth when he saw her, a reminder that his community stood with him. The judge entered, a stern-looking woman with gray-streaked hair and glasses that rested low on her nose. She took her seat and rapped her gavel once. "This court is now in session." Jack's pulse slowed as he watched the prosecutor, a young man in a cheap suit, stride confidently to the front of the room. He looked like he thought he was starring in a courtroom drama. Jack could almost hear the soundtrack playing in the guy's head. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we are here today to review the circumstances surrounding Mr. Grayson's detention." He picked up a file and waved it like a prop. The officers believed they were acting in good faith based on the description provided from the scene of the robbery. Jack's jaw clenched, but he stayed silent. The prosecutor continued. The vehicle in question, a black Chevrolet Caprice, matched the report from the witnesses at the gas station. It was reasonable for the officers to detain Mr. Grayson for questioning. Jack leaned over to Nate and muttered, "Reasonable, my foot." Nate smirked. "Let him dig his hole." The prosecutor laid down the file and motioned toward the judge. "To support this claim, we have a security photo taken from the station." He handed the judge a grainy black-and-white photo. Jack squinted from his seat. The image was so blurry it could have been anyone's car, or any old car, for that matter. The judge frowned as she studied the photo. "This could be a number of vehicles, Counselor," she said, her tone sharp. The prosecutor faltered, flipping through his notes. We believe further questioning is necessary to determine Mr. Grayson's involvement." Nate stood, buttoning his jacket. "Permission to speak, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Nate walked to the center of the room with calm precision. Jack watched his grandson with a mix of pride and awe. Nate was composed, steady, and unshakable. "Your Honor," Nate began, "this case should not be about assumptions or guesswork. My grandfather was accused based solely on his appearance and the car he was driving. There is no evidence, none, that places him anywhere near the scene of the crime. He handed a folder to the judge. In this folder, you'll find signed statements from multiple witnesses at the grocery store who saw my grandfather at the time of the robbery. You'll also find a time-stamped receipt showing he was purchasing groceries when the crime occurred. The judge flipped through the papers, her expression shifting from neutral to annoyed as she absorbed the details. The courtroom was silent except for the faint rustling of paper. Nate turned to the prosecutor. You want to talk about reasonable doubt? This is not reasonable doubt, it is negligence. My grandfather was detained because of a stereotype, not because of facts. Jack felt a ripple of energy pass through the room. People shifted in their seats, leaning in. Even the reporters looked more alert. The judge set the folder down and folded her hands. "Counselor," she said, addressing the prosecutor, "do you have anything else to present?" The prosecutor swallowed, his confidence visibly draining. "No, Your Honor." The judge adjusted her glasses and looked at Jack. "Mr. Grayson, the evidence makes it clear that you were wrongfully detained. I commend you for your patience and your dignity throughout this ordeal." She paused, her tone softening. "You are free to go, and this court will recommend a full investigation into the officer's conduct." Jack's shoulders relaxed, the weight he had been carrying since that night finally lifting. He stood and adjusted his jacket, offering the judge a respectful nod. "Thank you, Your Honor." As he walked past Nate on his way out, Jack whispered, "You were right. They dug their own hole." Nate grinned and patted Jack on the back. "Told you." Outside, the sunlight felt brighter than before, almost like it was celebrating with him. Mary Perkins was waiting by the steps with a small bag of cookies she had baked that morning. "You did good, Jack," she said with a smile. "We all knew the truth." Jack smiled back, touched by her quiet faith. He took one of the cookies, warm from the sun, and bit into it. Nate leaned against the caprice, watching Jack with a satisfied expression. "So, what's next?" Jack finished the cookie and dusted his hands. "Next, we make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Nate nodded, his face serious. "I know some people who can help with that," Jack chuckled. "You and your mysterious connections." Nate smiled, but said nothing as they climbed into the car. Jack started the engine, the hum of the Caprice as steady as ever. As they pulled away from the courthouse, Jack felt something unfamiliar, but welcome, a sense of justice served. And for the first time in a long time, he believed that things could change. The Caprice glided down the sunlit streets, but the courthouse still lingered in Jack's rearview mirror, like a ghost he couldn't quite shake. Though the judge's ruling had set him free, Jack knew the fight wasn't over. Clearing his name was one thing, changing the system that had put him in that cell was another entirely. Nate sat beside him, silent but alert, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. Jack could tell his grandson's mind was working just as hard as his own. Finally, Jack spoke, his voice low but steady. "You think they're nervous?" Nate smirked. "They should be." Jack's lips curved into a half-smile. "Let's find out." With a deliberate turn of the wheel, Jack steered the Caprice toward the precinct where it had all started. The old car rumbled down the street, a stubborn reminder of resilience. As they pulled into the parking lot, Jack spotted a familiar patrol car, the same one that had lit up behind him on that dark road. Jack parked and killed the engine. The silence that followed was thick. Nate looked over at Jack, a question in his eyes. "You sure about this?" Nate asked. Jack nodded. "I'm done letting people like them think they can get away with it." He opened the door and stepped out. The precinct doors loomed ahead, thick glass and steel meant to feel imposing. Jack pushed them open and walked inside with Nate close behind. The front desk officer glanced up, clearly startled to see them again. Jack didn't pause. He walked straight past the desk and into the main hall. Nate gave the officer a polite nod as they passed. In the hallway, Jack heard familiar voices. He turned the corner and saw Officers Gaines and Mercer standing by the vending machine, chatting like nothing had happened. Gaines' gum chewer, as Jack still thought of him, was laughing at something, while Mercer leaned casually against the wall. For a moment, Jack simply stood there, taking it all in. The men who had cuffed him, detained him, and treated him like a criminal hadn't lost a wink of sleep over it. The sound of Jack's steady footsteps caught their attention. The laughter faded. Gaines and Mercer looked up, their faces stiffening as they recognized Jack. Nate followed a step behind, silent but watchful. "Morning," Jack said calmly. Gaines's jaw worked, as though he was deciding whether to speak. Mercer folded his arms, trying to look unfazed. "What are you doing here?" Gaines asked, his tone defensive. Jack stopped a few feet away and gave a slow nod. "Just tying up some loose ends." His voice was quiet, but carried weight. Mercer's eyes flicked toward Nate, then back to Jack. "The case is closed. You're free to go. What more do you want?" Jack took a step closer, his gaze steady. "You think this is about me?" He shook his head. "This is bigger than that. You think you can pull people off the street, treat them like suspects without a shred of proof, and walk away clean?" Jack's voice hardened. "Not anymore." Mercer shifted uncomfortably, but Gaines's expression stayed defiant. "We were doing our job." Jack's eyes narrowed. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to judge and accuse." The hallway had gone quiet. A few officers had stopped in their tracks, sensing the tension. One of them, a tall man in a dark suit, stepped forward. Jack recognized him immediately, an internal affairs officer. Nate had mentioned making calls, and now Jack understood just how deep those calls had gone. The IA officer pulled out a badge and introduced himself. "Detective Harris, Internal Affairs." He turned to Gaines and Mercer, his voice measured but firm. "Officers Gaines and Mercer, you're required to answer some questions regarding the events of last week. This is not optional." Gaines's bravado cracked. "You can't be serious." Detective Harris raised an eyebrow. "Dead serious." He glanced at Jack and Nate. "Mr. Grayson, your complaint has been heard, and we're going to make sure it's handled the right way." Jack nodded, gratitude flickering behind his stern expression. Harris turned back to the officers. "Let's go." As Gaines and Mercer were led down the hall, Jack noticed the panic etched into their faces, the same kind of helplessness they'd tried to force on him. For a brief moment, Jack felt a stab of pity, but it passed as quickly as it came. Nate stepped up beside Jack. "Well," he said, "that was satisfying." Jack huffed a dry laugh. "Yeah, it was." They turned and walked back down the hallway, past the curious glances of the officers who had witnessed the exchange. Outside, the morning air felt cleaner somehow. The Caprice gleamed under the sunlight like it was proud. Jack leaned against the hood and crossed his arms. "They're not gonna like this." Nate leaned beside him. "Nope, but that's the point." Jack looked at his grandson, pride swelling in his chest. "You pulled a lot of strings for this, didn't you?" Nate shrugged. "I've got friends in high places, and they don't like sloppy work." Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "Still not gonna tell me what you do, huh?" Nate grinned. "Let's just say, I make sure things get handled." Jack's gaze softened. "Whatever you're doing, you're making a difference." Nate nodded, his smile fading into something more serious. "So are you." Jack exhaled slowly, the anger that had simmered inside him for days finally cooling. "Feels good to finally push back." Nate placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. "This isn't just about you, Grandpa. It's about the people who'll come after you. The ones who might not have someone like me to make a call." Jack's jaw tightened as the truth of Nate's words sank in. He thought about the kids on his street, the young men who walked carefully at night just to avoid suspicion. He thought about all the people who never got their names cleared. "You're right," Jack said quietly. "But maybe Maybe this is the start of something better. Nate's eyes glinted with determination. We'll make sure of it. Jack nodded and climbed into the driver's seat. Nate slid in beside him. The Caprice roared to life, the old engine carrying their shared purpose as they pulled out of the lot. As they drove away, Jack glanced over at Nate. We've come a long way. Nate's grin was steady. And we're just getting started. The road stretched ahead, wide and bright beneath the morning sun. Jack knew it wouldn't be easy, change never was. But for the first time in years, he felt ready for whatever came next. The long road to justice might be rough, but he wasn't walking it alone anymore. The Caprice rumbled steadily along the familiar streets of Jack's neighborhood, the hum of the engine low and comforting. Jack's thoughts drifted as the warm Memphis breeze rolled through the open windows. The smell of freshly cut grass and charcoal from someone's grill filled the air, grounding him after everything that had happened at the precinct. Nate was quiet in the passenger seat, tapping his fingers rhythmically against his knee. Jack recognized the expression on his grandson's face. It was the look of someone carrying more than they were saying. Jack had seen it in himself too many times before. "You've been real quiet since we left," Jack said, breaking the silence as he slowed to a stop at a red light. "What's on your mind, Nate?" Nate turned slightly, resting his arm on the window frame. His lips pressed into a thoughtful line before he finally spoke. "I was just thinking, you shouldn't have had to go through all of this." He paused, his voice quieter now. "You've lived your life with more honor than most people I've ever known. And yet, this." Jack's fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel, not in anger, but in reflection. "I've learned that life doesn't always reward you for doing right," Jack said slowly. "But I never did the right thing expecting applause. I did it because it's who I am." He glanced at Nate. "What happened to me wasn't about me as a person. It was about the way the world works sometimes. But standing up today? That was about all the folks who don't get the chance to." The light turned green, and the Caprice rolled forward. Nate nodded, though Jack could see the tension still hanging around his shoulders. "You've been handling all of this like it's just another job," Jack said, casting him a sidelong glance. "But it's more than that to you, isn't it?" Nate let out a slow breath. "It is." He hesitated for a second, then added, "You're not the first person I've seen get caught up in something unfair like this. I've seen people lose everything over a misunderstanding or a bad assumption." His tone hardened. "But not you, Grandpa. Not on my watch." Jack took that in, his heart tightening with both pride and concern. "You've seen more than you're telling me, haven't you?" Nate's eyes flicked toward Jack. There was a faint vulnerability in them, quickly masked by that same quiet strength. "I've seen enough," he said. "Enough to know that sometimes it takes more than a calm conversation to fix things." Jack pulled into his driveway and shut off the engine. The house felt like a familiar anchor, small, worn, but steady, just like Jack himself. The two men stepped out of the car and headed up the porch steps. Jack sat in his usual chair, and Nate took the one next to him. The neighborhood was peaceful for once. Kids rode bikes down the street, and an elderly man across the way waved as he watered his lawn. Jack tipped his head in return, his mind still circling around everything Nate had said. Jack pulled a cigarette from his shirt pocket and lit it, taking a long, thoughtful drag before speaking again. "Nate, are you ever going to tell me what exactly you do?" His voice was calm, but curious. Nate smiled, though there was a flicker of hesitation behind it. "Let's just say I work for people who handle things when they need to be handled, quietly." Jack let out a small chuckle. "That your way of saying you're some kind of secret agent?" Nate laughed, but his gaze stayed serious. "Not exactly. But I'm part of something bigger. And when I heard what happened to you, well, let's just say I called in a few favors." Jack exhaled a stream of smoke and nodded. "That much I figured." He tapped the ash into the small metal tray beside him. "You always were good at making things happen." Nate leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I learned that from you. Jack's chest tightened at the quiet honesty in those words. I guess we're more alike than I thought. Nate's expression softened. I'm just glad I was in a position to help. They sat there in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the weight of everything that had happened settling, but not breaking them. Jack reached into the paper bag that Mary Perkins had left earlier and pulled out the last cookie. He broke it in half and handed one piece to Nate, who accepted it with a faint grin. Mary really outdid herself with these, Jack said, taking a bite. Nate nodded, chewing thoughtfully. She's always looked out for you. Jack swallowed and leaned back in his chair, letting the breeze brush over his face. Good people still exist, Nate. Sometimes they show up in small ways, a neighbor with cookies, a nod from someone who's seen the same struggle. He paused, his voice quieter. That's why we keep going. Not for the system or the big fights, but for the people who still believe in doing right. Nate sat quietly, taking that in. Then he glanced toward Jack, a thoughtful smile on his face. You've got more faith in people than most. Jack's lips quirked in a small smile. You see enough of the worst in the world, you learn to appreciate the good when it shows up. The sky above them was turning a soft amber as the sun began its slow descent. The laughter of kids drifted down the street, mingling with the hum of distant conversation. Jack took another slow drag of his cigarette and exhaled contentedly. Things feel different now, Nate said after a moment. Jack nodded. Yeah, but different doesn't mean worse. He looked over at Nate, his expression calm but steady. We stood up today, and because of that, maybe the next guy they pull over for no reason will get a second thought before those cuffs go on. Nate's gaze held steady. Maybe. And if they don't, we'll be here. Jack gave him a slow nod. Damn right we will. The wind picked up just enough to rustle the leaves on the old tree in Jack's front yard. The sun dipped lower, casting the street in a warm, golden glow. Jack and Nate sat there as the world settled into evening, their conversation trailing off into quiet understanding. The battles ahead would be hard, Jack knew that. But sitting there, side by side with his grandson, Jack felt something that hadn't settled in his heart for a long time. Hope. And for Jack Grayson, that was enough to keep moving forward. The evening rolled in gently, the sky bruised with shades of purple and orange as the last of the sunlight faded. Jack and Nate sat in the quiet for a while longer, watching the street lamps flicker to life one by one. The soft hum of cicadas filled the air. Jack finally stubbed out his cigarette and sighed, leaning forward. Well, Nate, it's been a long couple of days, but I've got a feeling things are just getting started. Nate gave a knowing nod, his face serious in the dimming light. You're right. What happened at the station was just one step. Those officers getting called out by internal affairs. That's not the end. It's the beginning. Jack leaned back and rubbed his hands together slowly. I'm tired, Nate. I don't mean the kind of tired that goes away with a good night's sleep. I mean tired of watching things stay the same. He paused, the weight of his words hanging in the air. We made noise today, but what happens when the noise dies down? Nate's jaw tightened. Then we make sure it doesn't. Jack turned his head, studying his grandson. The quiet fire in Nate's eyes wasn't something Jack saw every day, but it was there now, steady and unwavering. How do we do that? Jack asked. Nate's face softened slightly, but his focus didn't waver. There are people in this city who care, people who've been waiting for someone to stand up and push back. We've got witnesses who saw what happened to you. Folks are paying attention now. We use that. He paused and sat up straighter. I know someone who works with a local community group. They focus on making sure stories like yours don't get buried. They organize, they show up, and they hold people accountable. Jack raised an eyebrow. Activists? Nate nodded. Not the loud kind who burn bridges, The kind who build them. Jack gave a slow, thoughtful nod. I like the sound of that. He let out a slow breath. But I've never been one for speeches and rallies. Nate smiled. You don't have to be. You just have to show up and tell the truth. The rest will happen on its own. Jack leaned forward again, resting his elbows on his knees. His mind drifted to the people in the neighborhood, the young men who avoided eye contact with police, the families who kept their doors locked even during the day. There was a weariness that hung over this place, a quiet understanding that fairness wasn't always promised. Jack's voice was low when he spoke. If I'm going to stand up, Nate, I need to make sure it means something. I don't want this to just be about me. Nate's eyes softened. It isn't. Not anymore. Jack nodded slowly. The truth of that settled in his chest, solid and undeniable. They sat in silence again, the sky above them deepening into a canvas of stars. Nate pulled out his phone and tapped at the screen. Jack glanced over, curious. You calling someone? Nate shook his head. No, just sending a message. He slid the phone back into his pocket, letting the community group know we're in. Jack smirked. Fast worker. Nate shrugged with a grin. I try. The creak of the porch steps made both men look up. Mary Perkins was back, this time holding a small tray covered with a tea towel. She smiled as she approached. Figured you boys could use something sweet after all that bitterness today, she said, placing the tray on the table between them. Jack lifted the towel to reveal a plate of homemade peach cobbler, the crust still warm and flaky. The smell of cinnamon and sugar filled the air. Jack shook his head in quiet admiration. Mary, you spoil me. Mary smiled and waved a hand. Someone's got to. She glanced at Nate, her eyes kind. You keep an eye on him, you hear? Jack's been through enough. Nate nodded seriously. I will. Promise. Mary gave Jack's shoulder a light pat before heading back across the street. Jack watched her go, the tray of cobblers sitting like a reminder of how small kindness could carry the weight of the world. He handed Nate a fork and picked one up for himself. They ate in silence for a moment, the cobbler sweet and comforting. Jack savored every bite. It reminded him of summers long ago, before life had gotten complicated. Finally, Jack wiped his mouth with a paper napkin and leaned back. You know, this neighborhood got more good people in it than I sometimes remember. Nate nodded, his voice thoughtful. It's easy to forget when you're used to being let down. But there's strength here, Grandpa. We've seen it today. Jack took another bite and chewed slowly. You're right. And if they're willing to stand up with us... He let the thought trail off, but he knew Nate understood. Nate set his fork down and leaned in. They will. Once people see that they're not alone, things change. You've already shown them that. Jack let that settle in. For a moment, the weight he had carried for so long felt a little lighter. Maybe it was the cobbler or the steady hum of cicadas, but for the first time in a while, he felt a quiet hope flicker to life. He rested his hand on Nate's shoulder. You've been more than a grandson to me these past few days. You've been a partner. Nate smiled, his gaze steady. And you've shown me what real resilience looks like. Jack nodded, pride welling up inside him. I guess we make a good team. Nate chuckled. Yeah, we do. The streetlights cast soft halos over the road as the night settled in fully. Jack looked out over the neighborhood, the place where he had lived and worked, laughed and grieved. It wasn't perfect, but it was home, and for the first time in a long time, he believed they could make it better. Tomorrow, Jack said quietly, we get to work. Nate gave a small nod. Tomorrow. They sat together as the stars spread out above them, eating the last of the cobbler and letting the quiet of the night wash over them. Jack closed his eyes for a moment and let the calm sink in. He had fought through war zones, heartbreak, and injustice. Now, with his grandson by his side, he was ready for whatever came next. Because when good people came together, change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. The next morning, the neighborhood was already stirring when Jack stepped out onto the porch. The sky was a soft gray blue, promising another warm day, and the air smelled faintly of dew and fresh-cut grass. Jack's morning routine had always been simple: a hot cup of coffee, a quiet moment on the porch. But today felt different. Today felt like the start of something new. Nate came out of the house, phone in hand, dressed casually, but still looking sharp. "Morning," he said, handing Jack a second mug of coffee. Jack nodded his thanks and took a slow sip. "What's the word?" Nate scrolled through his messages, his face lit by the screen's glow. "Word spreading faster than I thought. The community group wants to meet today. They're getting together at the rec center at noon." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Noon. They don't waste time, do they?" Nate smiled. "People don't waste time when they finally see a way forward." Jack nodded, setting his coffee down on the small table beside him. The sun was rising steadily now, casting long streaks of gold across the cracked pavement. A few neighbors were already out. Mary Perkins waved from her front steps, and a group of kids sped by on their bikes, calling out greetings as they passed. Jack stood, adjusting the cuffs of his old shirt. "Well, if we're gonna do this, we better do it right." Nate followed Jack to the Caprice, and within minutes they were heading down the familiar streets toward the heart of the neighborhood. The rec center was an old brick building that had seen better days, but it was still a gathering place for the community. Its walls held memories of basketball games, bake sales, and town meetings. When they pulled up, Jack was surprised to see the parking lot filling up fast. Cars and bikes were parked in rows, and people were milling around the entrance, talking in low but excited voices. Nate and Jack exchanged a glance before stepping out of the car. Inside, the gymnasium was buzzing with energy. Metal folding chairs were set up in rows, and the faint squeak of sneakers on the old wooden floor reminded Jack of a simpler time. A man in his 50s with a salt and pepper beard approached them with a wide smile. Jack recognized him, David Harris, one of the longtime community leaders who had organized food drives and after-school programs for as long as Jack could remember. "Jack Grayson," David said, clasping Jack's hand firmly. "It's good to see you here, and you must be Nate." He extended his hand to Nate, who shook it with a respectful nod. David's smile faded slightly, replaced with a serious expression. "What happened to you last week?" "Well, it was wrong, but I have to say, the way you handled it, you made people pay attention." Jack shifted slightly, still not used to being the center of attention. "I didn't do it alone," he said, glancing at Nate. David nodded. "Well, that's why we're here today. People want to know what comes next." Jack and Nate made their way to the front of the room, where a small table had been set up for speakers. The crowd was bigger than Jack had expected. At least 50 people sat or stood, and more were still filing in. David raised a hand to quiet the room. "Everyone, let's get started." The murmuring died down, and David motioned for Jack to step forward. Jack hesitated for a second, but then he squared his shoulders and took the microphone. Jack cleared his throat and looked out at the crowd. He recognized so many faces: parents he had shared conversations with at the store, teenagers who had waved as they passed his porch, and older neighbors who had lived on his street since before he had moved in. "I'm not used to making speeches," Jack began, his voice steady but quiet. "But I know all of you, and you know me. What happened to me last week being detained? Treated like I was guilty before anyone asked questions that wasn't just about me. It could have been any one of you." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. "But here's the thing," Jack continued. "We didn't just roll over and take it. We spoke up, and because of that, the officers responsible are facing consequences. That's because we didn't stay quiet." A ripple of nods and murmured agreement passed through the room. Jack felt a steady strength building inside him. "The system won't change on its own," Jack said. "We've seen that. But if we work together, if we support each other and hold people accountable, We can change things. Nate stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. There's a way to do this. We don't need to burn bridges or create chaos. We need to organize, make sure we're heard. That's what today is about, figuring out how we make our voices stronger. David smiled and took the mic again. That's why we're setting up Teams Today groups to handle outreach, communication, and making sure stories like Jack's don't get lost. A woman in the front row raised her hand. How can we help if something like this happens again? Jack leaned toward the mic. We show up. We speak up. We don't let fear keep us quiet. The woman nodded, her expression fierce with determination. For the next hour, plans were made. Volunteers signed up for committees, flyers were passed around, and people who had been silent for too long found their voices. Jack watched it all unfold with quiet pride. After the meeting, Nate and Jack lingered as people trickled out. David approached them again, his eyes bright with gratitude. "You've done something important here," he said. "People believe again." Jack gave a small nod. "It's a start." Nate clapped Jack on the shoulder. "One hell of a start." They walked back out to the Caprice as the afternoon sun burned high in the sky. Jack felt the warmth on his face and breathed deeply. The weight of the past week was still there, but it was lighter now, shared by the people around him. As they drove home, Nate glanced over and smiled. "You ever think you'd be leading a movement, Grandpa?" Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "Not in a million years." He paused, his grin softening. "But I'll tell you something, Nate. It feels right." The road stretched ahead, bright and full of possibility. Jack felt the quiet hum of hope deep in his chest. Whatever came next, they were ready for it. The morning sun rose slowly over the neighborhood, painting the houses in soft amber light. Jack sat on his porch, nursing a fresh cup of coffee. The air was warm but gentle, the kind of morning that made everything feel possible. The old Caprice sat in the driveway, its black frame glistening faintly from the dew. Jack felt a quiet calm as he watched the street begin to stir. People were starting their day, mothers walking their kids to the bus stop, neighbors wheeling their garbage bins to the curb. There was a quiet hum of life that felt different. It wasn't just in his head. He saw it in the way people waved to each other, stopped to chat longer than usual, and exchanged nods that meant more than polite greetings. The events of the past week had lit a spark. The neighborhood had come alive with purpose. Nate stepped out onto the porch, rolling up the sleeves of his shirt. His face was more relaxed than Jack had seen it in a long time. He sat down next to Jack, holding his own mug of coffee. "You're up early," Jack said, a slight smirk on his face. Nate chuckled. "So are you." He took a sip of his coffee, his gaze drifting down the street. "It's been a busy week." Jack nodded. "That's one way to put it." They sat in silence for a few moments, the warmth of the coffee settling into their bones. Finally, Jack spoke again, his voice soft but steady. "You think things will really change?" Nate leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I do." He paused, glancing at Jack. "But not overnight. This isn't one of those quick-fix things, Grandpa. It's work. And sometimes it'll feel like we're not getting anywhere." Jack gave a thoughtful nod, swirling the coffee in his cup. "Yeah, I've lived long enough to know change doesn't come easy." He looked at Nate. "But I also know it starts somewhere." Nate smiled faintly. It already started. Just then, the familiar creak of a bike chain caught their attention. A group of kids pedaled by 3 boys and a girl, their laughter loud and free as they raced down the street. Jack watched them, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. One of the boys skidded to a stop in front of Jack's house. "Mr. Grayson," the boy called out, waving. Jack raised his hand in return. "Morning, Caleb." The boy grinned. "My mom said you're a hero now." Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "Your mom's being kind." Caleb's grin widened. "She says kindness matters." Jack's smile deepened. "She's right about that." With one last wave, Caleb took off after his friends, his bike tires kicking up dust. Jack watched him go, the boy's words hanging in the air. Kindness matters. Nate leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. Kids notice everything, huh? Jack nodded, his expression soft. Yeah, that's why it's worth fighting for something better. Just then, a familiar car pulled into the driveway, Mary Perkins's old beige sedan. She stepped out, holding a small cooler in one hand. She waved as she walked up the steps. "Thought you two could use a proper breakfast," she said, setting the cooler down. Jack laughed as he opened it, revealing neatly wrapped breakfast sandwiches and orange juice. "Mary, you're gonna spoil me rotten." Mary waved a hand dismissively. "You deserve it after this week." Nate grabbed a sandwich and took a big bite. "You keep feeding us like this, and I'm never leaving." Mary laughed. "Good. Jack needs someone to keep him on his toes." Jack gave a mock scowl. "I'm still plenty sharp, Mary." Mary smiled fondly. "I know you are." She paused, her expression softening. "You made us proud, Jack. All of us." Jack swallowed the lump that formed in his throat. He gave her a slow nod. "Thank you, Mary." She patted his shoulder lightly before heading back to her car. Jack and Nate watched her drive off, the smell of warm biscuits lingering in the air. After a few minutes, Nate set his plate down and stood. "We've got that meeting at the community center later today." Jack stretched and stood too, adjusting his shirt. "What time?" Nate checked his phone. 2 o'clock. They're bringing in someone from the local news station to talk about community reform." Jack raised an eyebrow. "News station, huh?" Nate smirked. "Yeah, turns out people are starting to care." Jack let that sink in as they walked toward the Caprice. "Funny how that works," he muttered. Nate laughed. "Yeah, funny." The Caprice's engine rumbled to life, steady as always. As Jack pulled out onto the street, he felt something settle in his chest, a quiet contentment that had been missing for far too long. As they drove past the rows of small houses, people waved from their porches. Jack returned each wave with a nod, feeling connected to something bigger than himself. When they reached the community center, the parking lot was already half full. Jack parked and stepped out, adjusting his collar as the warm afternoon breeze ruffled his hair. Nate came around the side of the car and clapped him on the back. "Ready to make some more noise?" Nate asked with a grin. Jack chuckled. "Let's call it steady noise." They walked toward the building together, side by side. Jack noticed the hand-painted banner strung across the entrance. "Together for Justice." The letters were bold, painted with care. He felt the words settle deep inside him. Inside the gymnasium, familiar faces greeted them: David Harris, Mary Perkins, and a handful of neighbors who had been at the first meeting. There was a quiet energy in the room, like everyone could feel the change taking root. As Jack took his seat near the front, he heard someone behind him say, "That's Jack Grayson, the man who stood up." Jack smiled to himself. He wasn't one for titles or attention, but those words felt different. He wasn't just a man who had lived through struggle, he was a man who had pushed back, who had shown people that kindness, perseverance, and resilience mattered. Nate leaned over and whispered, "You good?" Jack nodded. "Yeah, I'm good." The meeting began, and Jack listened closely as the plans unfolded: more outreach, more ways to keep the pressure on. The road ahead would be long. Jack knew that, but as he sat there, surrounded by familiar faces, he felt the steady hum of hope in his heart. Because when good people came together with open hands, instead of closed fists, things could change. As the sun continued its slow journey across the sky, Jack Grayson, Vietnam vet, mechanic, and neighborhood fixture, felt something rare and precious: peace, not from quiet, but from purpose. The long road to justice stretched out before him, and for the first time in a long time, he was ready for every mile. As Jack and Nate walked out of the community center that afternoon, the sun hung high above, lighting up the path ahead. The Caprice sat waiting for them, a symbol of endurance, patched up but steady, just like Jack himself. They climbed in, the old engine rumbling to life, ready for whatever came next. Jack glanced at Nate, a small but content smile on his face. 1 mile at a time, right? Nate nodded. 1 mile at a time. With that, they pulled onto the road, carrying their story forward, not just for themselves, but for everyone who needed to know that change was possible. Thank you for joining us on Jack Grayson's journey, one of resilience, hope, and the belief that kindness and courage can make the world a better place. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more gripping, heartfelt tales, please hit that subscribe button and give us a like. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this, filled with the spirit of perseverance and the power of community. Stay tuned for more stories that inspire, challenge, and uplift. We'll see you next time. Take care, and remember you're never alone on the long road to justice.